Let's jump right in with how Queen Elizabeth II helped inspire this piece.
Sure. Well, I arrived in Louisville and then just a couple days later, actually a couple weeks later, but a couple days after the very first concert with the Louisville Orchestra of the season, I woke up, and was ready to try to write music facing the blank page. Um, and at that stage of composing, it's actually quite easy to procrastinate. So I went on my phone and I was looking at whatever news, and there it was, the funeral unfolding. I wake up very early, so it was 5 in the morning here, and it was 10 in the morning there, and it was all unfolding in the streets there. It was just absolutely amazing, and I just couldn't stop watching. I couldn't stop watching. It was tremendous.
So, how did that lead you to?
Well, I mean, there were some specific things. One of them was I noticed that I was listening for the rhythms that emerged from what I was seeing and hearing. That's one very specific thing. So, for example, the title "Send the Carriage Through" was actually one of the commands that one of the guards was shouting to the bearer party, right, or to the assembled um, forces there. And that was the rhythm of that particular statement, was "Send the carriage through." And the rhythms that they used, that these various different people, and it was always different people because it was such a massive scale thing, that the commands that were ringing out were often ringing out from different people, right? Because there couldn't be one conductor, right, at the center of the orchestra, or of the orchestrated event. It had to be different people doing different things, which is fairly fascinating to me. So I started writing down the rhythms of these various commands, because the rhythms of the commands actually determined then the lockstep, the sort of the motions that people would make. So I thought, they're giving information there. They're actually giving the command itself, but they're also giving the tempo. So I was just riveted. I started writing down all of these rhythms that I was hearing. And then I started noticing other things about the procession, like the fact that when there were these drums that would beat and help them walk at um, a precise number of steps per minute, which I read in the New York Times was exactly 75 steps a minute. I mean, it was down to a T. Like everything about the event had been curated just unbelievably carefully. And from what I gather, by the Queen herself. She was the one who organized all this, right? So she's, in fact, we always talk about dead composers. Here, the Queen actually was a composer who's no longer with us, sort of like Beethoven, right? Who's on the concert with me. So I was thinking a lot about leaders, and especially leaders, or uh, huge figures that who are no longer with us, and how we let them continue to govern our ideas of the world. And I would put both Queen Elizabeth and Beethoven in that category for many, many people, right? So you can see how I spent the day just kind of ruminating, sometimes because it was hours long, you know. Sometimes I was writing down rhythms of commands, and other times I was just sort of, I was ruminating on this incredible human ritual that we have of sort of honoring those who have gone before us, especially people that we feel are great, honoring great people, who came before us. And I also started getting really interested in the idea of leadership, right? The idea that not a single person was uttering these commands. So one of the things that audiences will hear and see when they come to the performance this weekend is that they'll see that it's not just going to be about Teddy Abrams facing the orchestra and conducting my piece. There's going to be a lot of other ways in which different people actually take on leadership in a variety of ways. So that's another way in which the experience of watching the funeral procession permeated the composition of the piece, sort of conceptually, in a very specific way.
That was something that, now that you portray it as a moment of leadership for the Queen,
Mm-hmm.
To consider that it was actually probably the leadership where she was the most directly and precisely influential. Like she wasn't hinting that something should be a
Right.
certain way. She was very specific.
Oh,
And it
that's
all
interesting. Yeah.
happened, and it was the one event that she couldn't enjoy.
Yeah, that's right. That and yet she was at the center of it, wasn't she? It's just so strange, right? And you're right. I mean, likening it to a musical score is not such a stretch, right? I mean, it was incredibly specific what she wrote the score for her own big day, right? And she was at the center of it. It's so interesting to me.
So then in this rumination on leadership, which is the exact phrase
Yeah.
that I wrote down before you just said,
Okay.
of the most practical nature, now that the piece is being rehearsed by the orchestra,
Yeah.
what else has reflected back to you about the nature of leadership?
Well, since the last time you and I spoke, right, which was before I even arrived in Louisville, I have gotten to know the players and I've gotten to know Teddy. And so this is not just a piece for orchestra. This is a piece for this orchestra and these people. Plus, you know, Teddy is a pianist. He's a collaborator. He's somebody who celebrates the sort of he celebrates the various gifts of his team. Look at what he's doing with us in the Creators Corps. He obviously is not scared of like you know collaborative leadership. It's something that it's something that he thrives in, that kind of paradigm. So I decided that I would, both because of that and also because I got fascinated with the sort of research I was doing around Beethoven's, these two pieces, the Fifth Symphony and the Emperor Concerto. Most audiences of today don't realize that when those pieces were written, the word conductor actually wasn't really a word. Conductor was not in print as a word to refer to the act of leading an orchestra until 1820. And it was only later, even than that, that conductors started regularly turning their backs to the audience and conducting, the orchestra. So that was also, most people led, mostly it was composers who led their own works. They mostly looked at the audience and, or they led from the keyboard or they led from the concertmaster's chair. Right. So one of the things that I think audiences can also expect to see is that I was sort of ruminating on not just leadership as a concept, as inspired by watching this thing with the Queen, but also leadership in specific, the history of leading the orchestra. And because my piece is on a program with Beethoven, it's almost as if I was invited to sort of go back to this kind of period of musical history and consider the you know it reminds me of like, what is it, History of the World Part One, the movie, like that kind of thing. Sort of like a micro history of leadership of the orchestra in my piece, which is maybe, I don't know, 14 minutes long, 15 minutes long, so people get a little sort of jam-packed view of.
You also compose quite a lot of vocal music. Do you generally
Yeah.
find yourself latching onto a text in that way, even when you're composing for instruments?
Not as specifically as this, I'd say. I mean, when I'm composing for instruments, yes, I often am inspired by literary works because I'm an avid reader and I am always in the middle of a million things. And that's part of the way I start my morning. Everyone has their morning ritual, right? I've got like coffee and, my diary and the Times crossword and my yoga. And then I read. And I read until what I'm reading is fills me so much with a focused sort of, it's my main source of inspiration, and I get great joy from reading. But that's a little bit different than actually writing down, like, the rhythms of commands, and using them specifically in the piece like that. I guess that's the kind of thing I would do, but I'm not sure it's necessarily. I think it's remarkable that way. I kind of got interested in it, and it had less to do with the fact that it was language than with the fact that um, that it was language that was also being used as a rhythmic cue, and also that it was coming from so many different sources. So it was yet again another example of sort of decentered leadership, right?
Now, you described sitting in Louisville with the blank piece of
Yeah.
paper, and
Yes.
we can think Queen Elizabeth did not die that long ago.
Yeah.
How fast did the turnaround for this whole
Oh
piece
man.
feel for you?
It was really fast. Well, it's interesting because I had a pre-concert talk. Um, we did it, the three of us, TJ, Tyler, and I did a pre-concert talk at the very first concert of the season, and that was a couple days before the Queen's funeral. So that would have been in September, right? And we started our roles here in Louisville at the beginning of September. I'd known that I would be coming here, and so I started working on an orchestra piece. I started drafting or whatever. But I remember telling the audience that day that the experience of working with the Louisville Orchestra for the first time convinced me that I should scrap all the work that I had done and start over, because I really did want to lean into, the imprimatur that was like, write the piece as a Louisvillian, write the piece as a creator in residence. So I took it very seriously, actually. I took it very seriously. And that means that I mean, maybe some of your audience doesn't know how much time it takes to write something for a symphonic orchestra that is 15 minutes long. This has some special things too, because the score is crazy, because there's people doing different things and there are people in the balcony. So this has a sort of a higher conceptual burden of creativity on it as well. And ordinarily, I probably would have spent around 5.5 months on a piece like this. But I had more like 2.5, 3 at the most. Yeah, 2.5 months.
That's like Franz Schubert level of
It's pretty intense. It's
compared
pretty
to,
intense.
we talking about the history of leadership in
Yeah.
orchestras. I mean,
Yeah.
composers, we have stories about them taking 10 years to write their first symphony. And so,
Sure, yeah. I mean, there's Mahler, who conducted all year, and then he wrote music in the summers. He just cranked it out, but then you sort of wonder, well, but he was sort of, I don't know. I mean, people have different rates, and I'm pretty fast, I guess. I mean, I'm focused. I'm able to work very, very hard, but I did work very, very hard. And I'll tell you what was easier about working hard is that TJ and Tyler lived down the block from me. We live on the same block. So I experienced just incredible support from them. And their deadlines are coming up soon too. So I'm trying to give back a little bit here. I mean, I would get texts saying, "Hey, I made too much pasta. Do you want some?" And then a couple of minutes later, I'd have like a lovely hot plate of pasta on my porch. So sweet. It was great.
what in the orchestra did you particularly latch onto as making it Louisville? Like, what about the Louisville Orchestra makes it the Louisville Orchestra?
Well, there's, the Louisville Orchestra is, and I know that Teddy's tenure has been, I don't know, something nigh upon 10 years or something at this point, coming up to 10 years. There is a kind of a readiness, like they know that they're gonna do new work. They're ready to dive into that, and they know that Teddy's going to introduce them to, is going to make them sort of into collaborators on new ideas. So there's that. They're not the only orchestra that does that, but they do have that particular kind of readiness to expect that and to dig in, right? But then also, as is evidenced on this concert, right? They have a season that is, there's a Louisville audience that's very passionate about these big, well-loved pieces, right? So there's a kind of a balance between sort of honoring the tradition, and celebrating the sort of core tradition of orchestral music, which is really why cities have symphony orchestras, right? Because there's a way in which there's this time-honored tradition of having an orchestra at the center of your city, as a way to kind of participate in this sort of culture that's shared all over the world, right? But then, meanwhile, Louisville is a very has a lot of musical realities, and so to the degree that Teddy has been sort of reaching towards the other musical sort of communities, non-orchestral or non-classical, those energies are also here in the city, and also you can feel them in the orchestra, the kinds of projects. I know that TJ spent some evenings just going over to some of the players' houses and improvising with them. And there are these kinds of relationships that have developed. I have an extended solo at the beginning of my piece for one of the players who's a composer himself. So I went to his house and kind of tried stuff out. And so these are the kinds of things that really get into a piece, and you start to know individual people like that in the orchestra.
What has the orchestra done besides, that the housing and bringing you to town for the year, but what specifically have they done to make this work this well? Because you can't set up, a piece of music to come into fruition this quickly without some
Yeah.
serious tools at your disposal.
Right. Well, I mean, they had us set up. This is sort of mundane, but I think this is what you're asking. They had us set up with studios here in our homes, computer and keyboard and everything. We were wired and ready to go. Right. They've provided us with a copyist, with a team, with people that can help us get the materials, together, in the time that we have. And there's a sense that the staff knows where, when things are happening, and there's support there. Just, can you make copies for me of this thing? I'll bike over later, little things like that. And then I think also just again, the fact that they put us all in the same neighborhood. I mean, one of the things that really is the most special about this is that there are 3 of us. In fact, my piece is dedicated to TJ and Tyler, because I feel like we got plopped down here together, but then we instantly, because we were given each other, we instantly we text each other all the time with like gnarly, orchestration questions, or like, I mean, I don't, not only do I know how their pieces are going right now, I know what section they're working on. And I know what they're grappling with. And we know how well each other slept last night. These kinds of things. And that is, you can't really replace that. It's a family.
It is a little bit, it sounds a lot like the conservatory experience or the school of music experience, like that we just kind of get dropped out of upon graduation.
It's interesting because I never had that experience.
Right.
I never went to music school. I was a literature major.
Right.
And, at Yale. And then I never went to graduate school because I just came to New York and started working. So I hear you. I think maybe that's why I'm enjoying it so much. I never really had that.
What outside of the orchestra, put all orchestra aside, put the piece of music
Yes.
aside, what have you loved about Louisville?
I have a ritual on Saturdays that I absolutely adore, which is that I bike no matter how cold it is. I've been biking even if it's like 25 degrees. I bike over and get a huge breakfast with shrimp and grits, and then I get on my bike again and keep going up the hill to the farmer's market. And I do all my shopping, and I know a lot of the farmers there now. And I do all my shopping. I put it all in my bike bag, and then I bike around Cherokee Park and back down. I stop for coffee on the way. This is every Saturday, and it's funny, it's exciting. There's a rush of joy every time I rehearse with the orchestra, but for some reason, there's also a rush of joy every time I like see my farmer and put my, lacinato kale in my bike bag and zip away. I mean, I never knew how to ride a bike before I came to Louisville. I bought it here and I taught myself to ride it, and now I ride absolutely everywhere. It's just I have a distinctive experience of living here that is based around the fact that I bike everywhere and I'm getting all over the city. It's really tremendous.
I feel like you've talked about the bicycle a lot, and it was the
I
thing
know.
I'm most excited about when
She's
we
my true love,
first
Bella.
met. So I kept feeling like your bicycle was gonna make its way into a piece of music, either
Oh
as
yeah, I know, right?
inspiration or
Well,
part of
yeah.
it.
We're not even halfway through our time here yet, so
There's still time.
stand by. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much
Oh,
for
you're
talking about
welcome.
it. Excited
Yeah.
to hear how it all turns out, and
Yeah, me too.
yeah.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks, Colleen.